Cops, what's the craziest excuse you've ever heard that ended up being true? Story 1. One night, I was out working when I spotted a guy riding a bike down the street, no lights and dragging a lawnmower behind him on a rope. It was around midnight in a decent middle-class neighborhood, but it was surrounded by some high-crime areas. I immediately flipped a U-turn, lit him up, and recognized him as a local homeless guy with a history of burglary and theft. I walked up and just sighed, "Dude, come on." He immediately held up his hands, swearing he hadn't stolen the lawnmower. According to him, someone had just given it to him. I asked who, and of course he didn't know the name, so I told him to take me to this generous stranger. His directions? Go that way a bit, take a right at the stop sign, then go down one of those side streets. It's about halfway down a street at a house with a pickup and a car in the driveway. By this point, backup had arrived, so I left him with them and set off on this ridiculous scavenger hunt. I guessed at the first turn, then mentally flipped a coin to pick between the next 3 possible streets. I went with the second one and started looking around. Turns out about half the houses on that street had both a truck and a car in the driveway. At least a dozen of them fit the description. But halfway down, I randomly picked an average-looking house and thought, hey, might as well try this one. I rang the doorbell, and a middle-aged guy answered, "Sir, by any chance, have you been handing out lawnmowers to random sketchy homeless dudes at midnight?" To my absolute disbelief, he said yes. Apparently, his wife had gotten fed up with his repeated failed attempts to get the thing running and had ordered him to get rid of it. He had literally just pushed it to the curb when the homeless guy rode by and asked if he could take it. The guy said sure, and that was that. I drove back in shock, apologized to the guy, and let him go. A few months later, I ran into him at a gas station, and he told me all it needed was a new spark plug. He got it running again and sold it for $150. For years after that, whenever I ran into him, he never failed to remind me about the money he made from that stolen lawnmower. LOL. Story 2. Not exactly an excuse, but it completely caught me off guard. I'd always heard that someone with extremely high blood sugar could act just like a drunk person. We get a call about a car swerving all over the road, hitting trash cans and everything. We pull the driver over and get him out. He's slurring his speech like crazy, can't keep his balance to save his life, and absolutely bombs every sobriety test. But when we run a breathalyzer, blows a 0, he keeps swearing up and down that he hasn't had a drop to drink and hasn't taken any drugs, never once mentions anything about diabetes. We're all standing there confused as hell, and then I remember hearing about the blood sugar thing. Call for medical, and sure enough, his blood sugar is 550. That's when he suddenly remembers he hasn't taken his insulin in over 8 hours. Story 3. My dad is a cop, and one time he pulled someone over for speeding and running a red light. Their excuse? My breast implant just burst. Figuring it was serious, he called EMS to rush them to the hospital. Turns out they weren't lying. It had actually ruptured, and while not always life-threatening, it can be pretty dangerous if it leaks. Story 4. Pulled over a college kid for some terrible driving and ended up finding about 100 grams of weed on him, plus a 1-pound glass pipe shaped like a giant nail. No big deal. Also found some weed under the other students in the car, but the driver immediately takes the fall, claiming everything was his so his friends could walk. I like this kid already, but then during the search, we find some packaged Adderall hidden in the cellophane of a cigarette pack with the top melted shut. I ask if he's dealing. Tell him I know how bad the prescription pill problem is. He insists he's not, swearing up and down that he only carries a few because his orange pill bottle has been stolen so many times. He genuinely seems like a decent guy, so I take the X-Files approach. Trust, but verify. Supervisor tells me to charge him for distribution. I tell the kid he has one chance to prove he's telling the truth. First, he shows me broken glass under his driver's seat from a past car break-in. Not enough. Then, I follow him back to his dorm, where he shows me a busted footlocker under his bed where he kept his meds. Still weak. Supervisor's getting impatient, telling me to hurry up and drop the axe. I tell the kid he needs to do better. He calls a soccer team assistant and takes me to the locker room, where he shows me his assigned locker with a broken lock. Then, the assistant coach steps in and tells me they've replaced the lock 3 times. Campus security has multiple reports of medicine theft from this kid. Nice. I call my supervisor back and tell him I have 0 grounds to push delivery charges. Turns out the poor guy had just been getting his Adderall stolen so often that, being the big dumb meatball he was, he started packaging them like that to keep them safe. A few months later, I break up a house party and end up talking to his best friend. Friend tells me the kid is a solid guy who only smokes weed to manage extreme anxiety, which totally checks out from my interaction with him, and has never sold anything in his life. He even thanked me, saying his buddy spoke highly of me. Then he tells me the kid had such a bad panic attack from the whole incident that he had to drive him to the hospital a few hours after I left. I felt bad for him. So now, whenever I see him smoking in his car at the mall parking lot, I just wave. Story 5. I'm not a cop, but I did get stopped by one for eating a taco. I worked at a community college in LA that was right next to a high school. There was a lot of drug activity going on through the fence at the high school, so cops were constantly patrolling the street between the two schools. Since I was just an employee and not a student, I couldn't get a parking pass, so I always parked on that street. One day, I grabbed Taco Bell for lunch and was sitting in my car, happily enjoying my double-decker tacos when a cop drove past. Next thing I know, he's flipping a U-turn and heading straight for me. He pulls up window to window with my car, leans out and yells, "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Completely stunned, I just blurt out, "Eating my lunch?" He's not buying it. He insists I'm hiding something. I just hold up my taco, looking as confused as humanly possible. He stares for a second, then bursts out laughing and peels out. Saw him a few times after that, and every time he'd wave with the biggest grin on his face. Story 6. Former U.S. Coast Guard here. Actually did law enforcement. For those unfamiliar, summers in the Carolinas, especially around Wrightsville Beach, Myrtle Beach, New Topsail, and Lockwood's Folly near the NC-SC border, are absolute chaos with drunk and or clueless boaters. With UNCW nearby, you've got college kids hammered out of their minds doing reckless shit on the water, BWIs, illegal charters, cutting across bows, ignoring no-wake zones, speeding outside of channels, you name it. Throw in the occasional drug or illegal firearms trafficking case, plus hurricane season, and we were slammed from May to September. One Friday afternoon, our OOD gets a call on Channel 16, basically 911 for boaters, about a capsized pontoon boat with around 20 intoxicated guys in the water. We roll up with another 47 from a nearby station and start pulling these drunk idiots out. Turns out they had stuffed 24 people onto a boat rated for 14, and of course, it flipped. As we're fishing them out, literally all of them are slurring threats about how their daddy's a lawyer and how they're going to sue us. It was like watching a bad MTV Spring Break special in real time. Turns out the whole boat was full of future lawyers, an entire frat from Elon University, all studying law, whose dads were also lawyers, didn't save them from charges for reckless operation, BWI, and running an unlicensed charter. Still, it was surreal. Dozens of drunk 20-year-olds crying, slurring threats, and begging us not to ruin their futures while we hauled them in. And don't even get me started on jet skier stories. Story 7. I'm not a cop, but a family friend was. One time, he pulled over a guy who was absolutely flying down the road. The guy looked completely disheveled and panicked. When asked why he was speeding, he blurted out, "I have a tick on my penis." The cop was understandably confused, but decided to escort him to the hospital instead of writing him up. He waited in the lobby, partly to check on him, and partly to see if the guy was just making it up. After a while, he asked the front desk what was taking so long. How hard could it be to remove a tick? The nurse's response? It wasn't on it, it was in it. Story 8, former park ranger here. During my first week on the job, we pulled up to a car with a couple of kids smoking inside with the windows down. The city had an ordinance against smoking in the park, but it was too petty to actually ticket them for it. As we approached, they got visibly nervous. My field training officer, FTO, took a quick look inside and spotted a couple of beer cans. Bingo. We got them out of the car and started running their info. They were all underage, but old enough to smoke cigarettes. My FTO asked where the beer came from, and the driver casually replied, "I recycle." My FTO chuckled, obviously not buying it, and started searching the car. Meanwhile, I finished running their info. The kids were surprisingly respectful, which was rare in situations like this. Then my FTO popped the trunk. Suddenly, he burst out laughing so hard he could barely breathe. I walked over to see what was so funny, and sure enough, the entire trunk was packed to the brim with crushed cans and bottles. The kid had been telling the truth the whole time. My FTO shook his head, uncuffed the driver, and let them go, saying he'd heard that excuse for 20 years, and this was the first time it was actually legit. Many users have asked, who is FTO, field training officer? New officers train under an experienced officer for a certain period after the academy. Why were they cuffed? In California, officers can detain and cuff someone for safety reasons if there's probable cause for a crime. Technically, smoking in the park was enough PC to justify it. Beer in the car? California has strict open container laws. Even if you're not drinking, just having an open container in the car can lead to DUI charges, depending on the circumstances. Park rangers? There are different types. Some are interpretive rangers, focused on history and nature. Some are firefighters, and some are law enforcement. Our department trained with LAPD and LA County Sheriff's Academies. But unlike regular officers, park rangers weren't armed, yet we were still expected to handle full police duties. I personally decided to move into the private sector before officially joining the academy, but I have massive respect for the unarmed park rangers who still handled police-level responsibilities. Those guys had nerves of steel. Story 9. Not a cop, but I had a pretty hilarious run-in with one when I was 18. I was on a double date with a friend, and we stepped outside a restaurant for a smoke. A cop came up and started hassling us, saying there had been a string of car break-ins in the area. After a bit, he told us he needed to pat us down. During the search, he pulled a brown paper bag out of my friend's pocket, got this smug look on his face, and said, "So what's in here, huh?" Without missing a beat, my friend deadpanned, "The Emancipation Proclamation." The cop, clearly thinking he had just caught us with something illegal, opened the bag, only to pull out a small booklet of the actual Emancipation Proclamation. Turns out, my friend had visited the Lincoln Museum earlier that day and just happened to have it in his pocket. The cop looked completely embarrassed and let us go. Story 10. Cop here. Got a call about a domestic dispute that sounded really bad. The caller reported a heated argument, lots of yelling, and loud banging. We get to the scene and can still hear shouting and what sounds like a full-on brawl inside. Not a good sign. A guy answers the door, shirt off, sweating and looking pissed, but also genuinely confused as to why the cops were there. I ask him what's going on and he says, "I was building IKEA furniture." Yeah, sure. Sounds like total bullshit. But we step inside and sure enough, half-assembled IKEA furniture is scattered all over the place. No one else is home. He was literally just fighting for his life against a shelving unit. Story 11. This was my favorite story from my 4th grade teacher, not a cop. She went to a cousin's wedding in mid-July, and the cousin had seriously overestimated how much champagne they'd need for the reception. At the end of the night, they were giving away bottles to anyone interested, so my teacher took 3 and tossed them in the backseat of her car. Did I mention this was a blazing hot July day? After saying their goodbyes, my teacher, her husband, and her parents all piled into the car and pulled onto the highway, when suddenly 2 bottles exploded. Champagne everywhere, absolute chaos. The driver, her husband, was now getting bathed in sparkling wine while trying to keep control of the car, which, of course, was swerving all over the place. And of course, just as they got themselves together, they saw flashing lights in the rearview mirror. They pulled over, and before my teacher could say a word, the state trooper walked up, took one whiff, and went, "I'm not even going to ask if you've been drinking. I can smell it from here." She tried explaining what had happened, but the cop wasn't buying it and had everyone step out of the car. That's when he got a good look. 4 well-dressed, clearly frazzled people, completely soaked in champagne. A quick search revealed the open bottles, but the cop still insisted on a sobriety check just to be sure. Story 12. I can't speak for the cop, but this happened to me during my freshman year of college. I was outside having a chill evening with my 3 roommates, longtime friends I grew up with, just drinking soda and smoking a tobacco pipe. One of my roommates went back into the dorm, and a minute later, I got a call from him saying, "Dude, get back to the dorm. Police are here and they're looking for you." Confused, I started heading over. Before I could even reach the building, the cops spotted me and ran up like I was about to bolt. They asked my name and if I had been at the dorm all night. I confirmed both. Turns out some other freshman, same age, build, and height as me, had signed in under my name for an intramural flag football game. He got into a fight, punched a guy and broke his jaw, then took off running in the direction of our dorm. I'm sure my excuse sounded like complete BS, but it was actually the truth. Story 13. Here's my best story. I arrested a heroin addict on a warrant, and while searching her purse, I found a small container with a grayish-brown substance that looked exactly. When I asked her what it was, she just started laughing and told me to test it. So I did. And it came back negative. That's when she casually explained that the container held the ashes of her dead cat. Apparently, when she went shopping for her friends, she'd take some for herself, and then cut the rest with her cat's ashes to make it stretch, which meant her friends had unknowingly been snorting or injecting her dead cat. Story 14. I was the one with the excuse, forgot my keys at a friend's place before going out drinking that night, got home around 2 a.m., no keys, only one window in the house didn't have ghetto bars, so I took off the screen and started smacking it up since the locks were only on the sides, just creating friction. As I'm halfway through the window, whump! I get tackled into my own house. The officer is still outside, gripping my ankles. I look up at him and without missing a beat say, "I gotta say, I'm astonished by your response time. I actually live here. Let me get up, unlock the door, and show you my ID." So I do. He stares at it for a second, then just says sorry and sprints off to keep looking for the actual suspect they were in the area for. Story 15. One day we got a call about a possible domestic violence situation. We arrived at the house, and the guy answered the door, wearing nothing but underwear. He immediately told us that he and his wife were role-playing. Obviously, we weren't just going to take his word for it. We asked to see his wife, but he refused to let us in. and we told him we'd come back with a warrant. And after a moment of hesitation, he reluctantly let us inside. He led us to the basement, opened the door, and holy shit. It was one of the most unusual and highly equipped private rooms I had ever seen. Chains, whips, and things hanging on the wall that I still can't identify. And in the middle of it all, hanging from chains, was his completely naked, gagged wife. We immediately asked if she was okay, and to our relief, she assured us she was fine. Turns out they were simply very passionate about an unconventional lifestyle. We advised them to keep the screaming confined to the basement and maybe tone it down a little. We kept a straight face the entire time, but the second we got back in the car, we absolutely lost it. Story 16. No cops are posting here anyway, so as a defense attorney, I'll throw my hat into the ring. A guy gets pulled over for impaired driving and later gets charged with OY. My boss gets the criminal complaint, and at his initial appearance, he insists he hadn't been drinking, even though he horrifically failed the sobriety test. She's sitting next to him, and, sure enough, he looks and smells wasted. Not exactly uncommon for alcoholics. Then, the deputies arrest him for bail jumping because he drove himself to court and, per his bail conditions, wasn't supposed to be drinking. He still swears he hasn't touched alcohol. Blood tests come back. He wasn't lying. Turns out the guy was diabetic and didn't even know it. When left untreated, diabetes can cause symptoms that mimic intoxication. Slurred speech, poor coordination, even the smell of alcohol on the breath. Got him some insulin. Charges dismissed. Story 17. All right, here's my crazy story, this time from behind the wheel. My uncle was in the middle of divorcing his awful wife. He wasn't perfect, but he was definitely in the right in this situation. At the time, he had temporary custody while the courts sorted everything out. Despite this, for some reason, his ex was still listed on the school paperwork as someone who could check the kids out. Well, picture day rolls around, and she shows up at the school, signs both kids out, and vanishes. I wasn't involved in the chaos of calling the police and tracking them down, but I did get pulled from school that day because I had my driver's license and could help out. Eventually, the kids were found and safely turned over to my mom and grandmother. My cousin, however, was devastated, not because of the whole kidnapping situation, but because she thought she'd miss picture day. It was her first time away from her mom, and she was finally allowed to be a cheerleader, which was a huge deal to her. So, being the only available driver with nothing else to do, I offered to rush her back to the school. My mom called ahead, and they agreed to keep the photographer there a little longer, but we were barely going to make it. This was rural Oklahoma, after all. I jumped in my car and flew down those dirt roads, doing 70 in a 35. Yeah, not my best decision. I was a 17-year-old with sky-high anxiety, dealing with my first ever family crisis. Of course, we got pulled over. I was panicking because I couldn't afford a ticket that bad, not to mention everything else going on. The cop listened to my shaky, anxiety-ridden explanation and, thankfully, let us off with a warning. The only reason he believed me? He had just pulled over my uncle going the same speed in the opposite direction with the exact same story. Story 18. Police officer here. A few years ago, back when I was living in Colorado, we got a call about a ghost in someone's house. I wasn't the one on the phone, but apparently the caller was completely hysterical and barely understandable. When I arrived, I found a woman, probably in her 40s, standing in her front yard looking absolutely terrified. It was a nice upper middle class home, nothing out of the ordinary. She swore there was a ghost inside. Normally, we wouldn't take that kind of call seriously, but she claimed she had been hearing screaming coming from the attic. She was home alone, no pets, and the neighbors were out of town. So, logically, her only explanation was paranormal activity. She was way too scared to check herself, so I grabbed my flashlight and headed up. The attic was exactly what you'd expect. Cobwebs, dust, and of course, a broken light bulb. Then I took a step. Suddenly, I heard banging and muffled yelling coming from the far corner. Navigating with my flashlight, I made my way over, and there, trapped in the floor, was a hobo. His leg had fallen through the boards, and he had been stuck up there for 2 days. The moment he saw me, he started crying with relief, thanking me while frantically asking for help. I carefully pulled him out, trying not to scratch his leg too much, then led him downstairs to get some water. He explained that he was just looking for a place to sleep and had very much learned his lesson about breaking into attics. Since he'd already been through enough, I let him go. Right as he was about to leave, he turned to me and said, "Actually, officer, could I trouble you for about $3.50?" That's when I realized he wasn't a hobo at all. He was a 50-foot tall gray Leviathan from the Paleolithic era. I looked him dead in the eyes and said, "I ain't giving you no $3.50 Loch Ness monster. Get out of here." Looking defeated, he turned and slowly made his way to the nearest lake. Story 19. Not a cop, but this happened to me when I was in university. I went to a party, got totally loaded, and decided I was too drunk to go to the bar. Instead, I started walking home. At some point along the way, I had a very clear thought. I'm way too drunk. A cop is definitely going to pick me up. I should just crash at Brent and Scott's place. So I walked right in, kicked off my shoes, yelled up the stairs that it was just me, something I'd done plenty of times before, and crashed on the couch. Fast forward about an hour and a half, maybe 1:30 a.m., and I wake up in cuffs. Now, I'm a really heavy sleeper, drunk or not, so the cops had apparently been struggling to wake me. When I finally come to, I realize I can't move my arms and see 2 cops standing there, along with a very confused family of 4. Holy shit, what did I do? The family is just staring at me while the cops start grilling me. In my half-conscious state, I blurt out, "Ugh, is Brent here?" Cops are not impressed. About 20 minutes of shouting later, I finally start piecing things together. I ask them the date. They say May 1st. Brent and Scott's lease had expired the day before. The new tenants had just moved in. I try explaining over and over and eventually ask if I can call Brent to prove it. The cops agree, so I hand them my phone. The officer asks Brent what his address was the day before, and sure enough, he recites the exact one I had just broken into. They still hit me with a drunk in public ticket, but at least I dodged a trespassing charge. Then they gave me a ride home. Story 20. A few years ago, I had a run-in with the cops, and to this day, I wonder what was going through their heads when they first stopped me. I had taken a cab home from a work party, pretty drunk, and accidentally gave the driver the wrong address. I ended up on a block that looked almost identical to mine, standing in front of a building that looked just like mine. My actual apartment was on the first floor of my building, and in both buildings, there were 2 doors before you got to the apartments. The first door was usually left unlocked, and the second was locked. Just like at home, the first door opened right up, but when I got to the second door, none of my keys worked. Confused, I kept trying different keys, still convinced I was at the right place. Eventually, I stepped outside to check for my car in the parking lot, and it wasn't there. That's when it hit me. I was on the wrong block. I started walking in the direction I thought my real apartment was when a cop car pulled up. They asked me what I was doing, and I just sighed. I'm really drunk, and I just want to go home. That was the absolute truth. Apparently, someone in the building had woken up and thought I was trying to break in. Cops were super suspicious at first, but after talking to me for a bit, it became very clear I was just some clueless drunk idiot, not a burglar. They ran my info to make sure I wasn't wanted for anything, and when I checked out, they actually offered me a ride home. The best part? The ride back was hilarious because when we were getting to my apartment, I tried telling them that it was a bit complicated to get to because of all the one-way streets. The officer driving was like, "Who do you think you're with?" And then turned on the lights and went the wrong way down the street to get me home faster. It honestly felt like I was with the 2 cops from Superbad. Story 21. I'm a deputy, basically a cop, but we handle county unincorporated areas. One night around 3 a.m., a few of us were hanging out at a gas station, grabbing coffee and snacks, just waiting for the next call. A guy pulls up in a pewter-colored Oldsmobile with a missing hubcap, hops out, and starts pumping gas. One of us notices he has a gun holster on his right side, but his shirt is covering it. Since we're in an open carry state, no big deal. But the way it was covered technically made it concealed, which isn't allowed without a permit. So we walk over, explain the law, and he immediately says, "Oh, my bad, I didn't mean to cover it." Totally reasonable. Then my partner casually glances into the passenger seat of his car. There, in plain view, is a fist-sized bag of white powder wrapped in saran wrap with multiple $20 bills stuffed underneath it. At this point, we're thinking, gun? Huge bag of white powder? Stack of cash? Yeah, this is definitely drug-related. So we ask him, yo, what is this, and why is it just sitting out in your car? Without missing a beat, the guy says, "Oh, that's powdered wall plaster. I just got it from my grandma." It's 3 a.m. at a gas station. Come on, man, we're cops, not idiots. Except, turns out he was telling the truth. Gun, legal and legally obtained. Criminal history, just some old speeding tickets and a minor fight charge from years ago. The powder, literally just wall plaster. The cash? His grandma gave it to him so he could patch up a hole in his wall because he was broke. Dude was actually super chill about the whole thing and even laughed, saying, "Yeah, I totally get why you thought that." So, he got a funny story to tell, and I guess now, so do I. Story 22. I got pulled over for driving to school at 10 a.m. The cop wanted to know why I was skipping school. I explained that our small town's girls basketball team had just won state, and since the game was so far away, the school let us start the day at 10:30 a.m. Apparently that wasn't good enough for him. He followed me all the way to school just to confirm my story with the principal. To this day, I have no idea what's illegal about driving to school at 10 a.m., but the guy was definitely on a power trip. Story 23. Not a cop, but I did get pulled over by a fire truck once. It was Orlando, August 1990, about 100 degrees outside. I worked for a computer rental company, delivering and setting up machines for trade shows. Our company van was a beat-up Chrysler minivan with 180,000 miles on it. No AC, so the windows were down. I was stuck in heavy rush hour traffic when I realized I was in a right turn only lane with no way to merge out. So I had no choice but to turn right. I hit the gas to get ahead of traffic and cut off a fire truck, one of those big flat front square ones, so I could get into the left turn lane and make a U-turn. As I sat there waiting for the green arrow, I looked to my left and saw a Dixie chopper lawnmower cutting grass by the road about 15 feet away. At that moment, I felt a massive wave of heat rush in through my open window. My first thought, damn, that's a hot lawnmower. Then the light turned green. Halfway through my U-turn, a huge cloud of what I thought was steam erupted from the hood, completely blinding me. At the same time, the power steering failed. I wrestled with the van, trying to get back to a gas station at the corner so I could use a payphone. Yes, I'm that old. But since I couldn't see, I missed the turn and ended up in an apartment complex instead. At that moment, the fire truck I had cut off earlier pulled into the complex, lights flashing, and blocked me in. 2 huge firefighters jumped out, each holding a fire extinguisher like it was a beer can. "Excuse me, sir, did you know your van was on fire?" Turns out, while I was cutting them off, I had been shooting flames out from under the passenger side of the van. They hit their lights, flipped a U-turn, and came after me. That massive heat wave, not the lawnmower. They checked the van and let me go. Later, I found out the cause. A damaged power steering line had been spraying fluid onto the exhaust manifold, which caught fire. Story 24. Stopped a guy for a suspended registration, and instead of getting mad at me, he starts getting pissed, but not at me. I ask what's wrong, and he goes, "It's my wife's car. She stopped making payments, and now it's suspended." But that wasn't even the worst part for him. He was on the way to his new girlfriend's place and was absolutely convinced she was going to dump him if he no-showed. I issue him a criminal ticket, assuming that would be the end of the story. Nope. Instead, he looks at me and says, "I totally get why you gave me a ticket, but I don't want this girl to dump me. Can you give me a ride there?" I laugh and tell him, "Fine, but you got to introduce me." Thinking, surely he'd back off now. Nope. Dude was dead serious. So off we go. We get to her place, but she refuses to come outside. He hands me the phone, so I tell her, either you come out and say hi, or I take him to jail. She finally comes out. And this guy hit the jackpot, 10-10. Story 25. A few years ago, during the holiday season, I was working at a coffee shop and went to a coworker's New Year's ugly sweater party or something like that. Had a few drinks until 10 p.m., then switched to water. At some point, a friend and I started talking about tea because, we worked with coffee and tea all day. He gave me a tea bag and a plastic baggie, and I just stuffed it in my pocket without thinking much of it. Fast forward to 2 a.m. I'm heading home, dead tired. I just want to sleep, so I'm blasting music to stay awake and maybe going a little too fast. Cue the party lights behind me. I pull over, and we go through the usual questions. Where are you coming from? Where are you going? Have you been drinking? Anything else we should know about? I blow clean on the breathalyzer. Walk the line, balance on one leg. All good. Then one of the cops pats me down and reaches my pocket. Him, "Son, what do you have in your pocket?" Me, already knowing how ridiculous this is about to sound. "It's tea, officer." Him, skeptical as hell. "You expect me to believe you just have tea in your pocket?" Me, "My friend gave it to me." At this point, his partner is visibly trying not to lose it. The first cop looks over his shoulder at him like, "Can you believe this guy?" Then back at me. Him, "Get it out." So I carefully pull out the plastic baggie, revealing a neatly labeled single-serving tea bag, and hand it to the officer, who now looks completely bewildered. Him, "Why the hell do you have tea in your pocket?" Me, dead serious. "I like tea, officer." At that point, his partner completely lost it, cracking up right there. The first cop sighed, handed me back my tea, and told me to go home and get some sleep. To this day, I've never been able to bring myself to actually drink that tea. It's still sitting on my shelf in the same bag. Story 26. A friend and I once had the cops called on us for climbing through our buddy's window. We showed up at his place, but he was in the bathroom and couldn't unlock the door. Luckily, the porch window was unlocked, so we figured, why not, and let ourselves in. As I was crawling inside, I noticed a car parked across the street with someone sitting in it and joked, "Man, this must look like we're breaking in." 5 minutes later, knock at the door. I open it, see a police officer, and immediately yell back into the house, "Hey, Jimmy, the cops are here." Probably not the smartest way to handle that. We tried explaining the situation while waiting for Jimmy to get out of the bathroom, but the cop was clearly skeptical. Even after Jimmy finally came out laughing, the officer gave him a serious look and asked, "Do you know these individuals?" Like, why would he be laughing if we were actual burglars? Story 27. I was driving with my fiance when we hit a roadblock where cops were checking registration and paperwork. We pulled up and they asked for our registration. Since I was in the passenger seat, I popped open the glove box, and right there, in plain view, was a clear, unmarked baggie, absolutely stuffed with catnip. I completely forgot it was in there. I froze. Wide-eyed, I slowly turned to look at the cop shining his flashlight through my window, only to see him frozen too, just staring at the baggie like, really? Without missing a beat, I blurted out, "Oh my God, I swear to God, this is catnip. You can take it, smell it, test it, whatever you need, I swear." At this point, the whole situation was so ridiculous that I just started cracking up. The cop took the bag, gave it a quick look, and realized I was telling the truth. Then he started laughing too, called his partner over, and explained the whole thing to her. They both stood there cackling for a solid minute before handing it back and sending us on our way. Story 29 had a domestic in progress. I responded to during Christmas Day, and the excuse for them fighting was, "We're not mad at each other. We're just upset because we wanted to surprise the kids for Christmas. We got some deer, dressed them up, and now they're destroying our house." I thought, yeah, okay, sure. Then I stepped inside. 3 fully grown white-tailed deer were running wild through the house, wearing full bell harnesses like Santa's reindeer. I had to call the game wardens, who thankfully helped me remove them without anyone, human or deer, getting hurt. To this day, I have no idea how they managed to get the deer in the house, let alone dress them up. Story 30. Not a cop, but this is one of my favorite stories. Someone crashed into a tree on their way to work, and as usual, they had an excuse. Because, let's be real, no one ever thinks they're at fault. This woman insisted she swerved off the road because an owl flew into her car. The cop, obviously skeptical, starts filling out the accident report. Then, when he gets into the car to move it for the tow truck, bam! A very real, very alive owl suddenly launches from the back seat, flies right past his face, and out the front window. I can only imagine how much that scared the hell out of him. And yes, the owl was officially included in the accident report diagram. Story 31. A long time ago, I was working swing shift and got off at 2:30 a.m. It was payday, so I went to the ATM to deposit my check. As I was riding my bicycle, a cop pulled me over for not having a light on it. He was really struggling to believe that I was just cashing my paycheck at 3:30 a.m., riding around with a backpack and no lights. He questioned me for a bit, but eventually let me go. Still, I noticed him pull into the McDonald's across the street and just watch as I went to the ATM, took out my check, and deposited it. He seemed genuinely perplexed. Story 32. Not a cop, but my dad rolls cigars. To seal the wrapper, he uses this white powder called vegetable gum. You mix it with water, and it turns into a sticky, clear adhesive. One night, after a rolling event, my dad had a massive bag of the stuff in his car when he got pulled over for a traffic violation. The cop spotted the bag sitting in a box and immediately asked what it was. My dad casually explained, "Oh, that's just vegetable gum." Yeah, they didn't believe him. They called for backup, cuffed my dad, and tested the powder right there. They let him go, but to this day, the story still cracks me up. Imagine getting arrested for cigar glue. Story 33. One of the funnier calls I remember, we got a report of an 18-year-old gang member brandishing a firearm. According to the caller, he had lifted his shirt to intimidate someone, revealing what looked like a holster. We arrived, took him down at gunpoint, and he immediately started yelling, "This is not a gun. This is a toy for adults." Sure enough, he was telling the truth. Dude was walking around with a holstered black vibrator just because he could. Story 34. Not a cop, but I have a very common name, and it nearly got me arrested once. Got pulled over for driving across the median, and the next thing I know, the cops are telling me there's a warrant out for my arrest for assault. I was stunned. Turns out a guy with my exact same name, same birthday, and born in the same city was wanted for some serious charges. It took me 20 minutes of pleading before the officers finally checked the description and realized I didn't match. Even now, I still run into issues because of this guy. Our social security numbers are off by 1 digit. If I ever meet him, we're going to have a long talk. Story 35. Not a cop, but I'm an attorney. I had a client who agreed to cooperate in a criminal case. He had been charged in a drive-by shooting, and as part of his deal, he had to reveal where he got the gun. His answer? I found it in a tree. The prosecutor immediately lost it, assuming my client was bullshitting him. He started going off on him until the detective suddenly spoke up. Wait, I had a case where the shooter claimed to have hidden his gun in a tree, but when we went to get it, it was gone. He asked my client where the tree was. Same tree. The prosecutor and I were both stunned. The guy had actually told the truth. Story 36. Back in university, I lived on campus for a year. One day, a cop showed up at my door accusing me of stealing checks. I had no idea what she was talking about and told her as much. She sighed loudly and told me I needed to be honest before things got serious. Turns out, another student at my school had qualified for the same grant as me. She called the organization for an update because she never received her check. They told her it had been sent out weeks ago, and when they checked, it had already been cashed into my bank account. Now here's the kicker. We had the exact same first and last name. For some unknown reason, she had put the school's address as hers, even though she didn't live on campus. So naturally, when a check with my name on it arrived at my address, I just deposited it, assuming it was mine. It took the officer a few minutes to piece everything together, but thankfully, I wasn't hauled off to jail for check fraud. When my actual check arrived a few days later, I just gave her the cash and called it even. Story 37. Not an excuse, but this one still cracks me up. I pulled over a woman for making a no U-turn where it was clearly posted. As I approached the car and she rolled down her window, I immediately caught the odor of intoxicants. I asked for her license and if she knew why I pulled her over. She said no, then started looking through her wallet before telling me she couldn't find her ID. Me, no problem. Just give me your name and date of birth. She confidently replies, Susan Murphy. Now, in a split second, my brain goes, gotcha. Her last name is clearly supposed to be Murphy, but she's slurring so bad she messed it up. So, just to be sure, I ask, Me, can you spell your last name for me? Without hesitation, she goes, Murphry. I was laughing so hard at myself I could barely finish the traffic stop. I ran her info, confirmed she had a valid license, and still had that booze smell lingering. So I asked, have you been drinking? Before she could answer, her three friends in the car yelled out, we're hammered. She's the designated driver. I just sighed, handed back her license, and said, have a nice day, ma'am. Story 38. Not a cop, but I've got one from the other perspective. I was home from college for fall break, and some friends wanted to smoke, but I didn't. So I just chilled alone in my friend's car, parked in some random development, while they went off to smoke with some girls elsewhere. About 10 minutes later, I suddenly see 3 cop cars come swarming in from every direction, lights flashing, spotlights blinding me right in the face. Immediately, I thought, great, some old lady probably thought we were robbing houses, so I decided to play it cool. The cops walked up, and I got out of the car. They asked, what are you doing here? And in the most panicked, dumbass move possible, I blurted out, my bro from college is trying to have sex with a girl, but we have to leave tonight. The cop's face immediately shifted from curious to, are you effing serious right now? A little while later, my friend came casually strolling out of the woods like he had actually sealed the deal. I walked up to him, ready to fill him in on the story, but before I could say anything, the cops yelled for him to come over. They asked, so what were you doing back there? Without missing a beat, my buddy shrugged and said, I was trying to get it in, but we just ended up talking about feelings. Story 39. I'm not a cop, but this is my friend's story. He pulled someone over and immediately noticed the guy's eyes were swollen and red. Assuming he might be on something, my friend questioned him. The guy insisted, I'm not high. I was just crying because my cat died. Yeah, right. Not convinced, my friend had him do a field sobriety test, and he passed everything. Afterward, the guy looked at him and said, do you want to come to my house and mourn with me? My friend had nothing better to do at the moment, so once he wrapped up, he agreed to follow him home. They arrived at the guy's house, and in the backyard was a giant tent. Inside, a gravestone that read, in loving memory of Floofy. My friend stood there for a moment and just thought, damn, that's actually really sad. Story 40. My partner and I arrested a guy one evening on a warrant. During the search, we found one of those small metal pill containers people keep on their keychains. You can buy them at Walgreens or any pharmacy. They're legal, but they're also sometimes used for drugs. The guy was a known drug user, and inside the container was a crushed white powder. Naturally, we assumed we had just found something illegal. We took him and the container back to the station for testing. At this point, we had used up multiple samples trying to figure out what the hell this powder was. Finally, I just looked at the guy and asked, what is in the metal container on your keys? He paused, then lost his damn mind. Those are my deceased father's ashes. Every ounce better be there. I immediately slinked out of the room, ran over to my partner, and just yelled, stop. Needless to say, he was not happy. Story 41. We had a woman who called 911 almost every night, claiming her neighbors were terrorizing her. She insisted they were prank calling her, setting off car alarms in the middle of the night, leaving things on her doorstep, and just generally making her life hell. Every time we responded, we found zero evidence of anything. One night, an officer even parked a block away to listen. Nothing. Yet, at that exact moment, she called 911 again, claiming the neighbors were setting off car alarms. I decided to dig into her history. Turns out she had lived in 3 different cities and had filed harassment complaints against her neighbors in all 3. At this point, we're all thinking, yeah, she's just nuts. But then one night she downloaded an app that unblocks phone numbers. I responded to her latest call, and when she showed me the number, I called it back. It was her neighbor. With enough pressure, we found out the truth. 2 70-year-old lesbians had been getting high in the middle of the night and tormenting their neighbor for fun. I turned it over to detectives, who got a warrant authorized. I never did find out why they were doing it, but honestly, what a plot twist. Story 42. Not a cop, but I was the one with the excuse. I had just started university, and one night, my friend and I decided to head back to my place. We walked in the front door to find my dad sitting on the couch, head in his hands, looking completely overwhelmed. Behind him, my 2 sisters were screaming, running back and forth with a plastic bin. The moment they saw me, they started yelling, "Grab the cats, they're trying to eat a bat." At this point, my friend and I immediately joined in on the chaos, screaming while trying to catch the bat and stop the cats from going full National Geographic. After what felt like forever, we finally caught the bat. For a moment, the house was silent. Then, bang, bang, bang. Someone knocked on the door. Dad answered it, then called us over. Turns out, the neighbors had called the cops because they thought someone was getting murdered. So now we had to explain to the officers that no, there was no crime in progress. Just a rogue bat, 2 insane cats, and a house full of screaming idiots. The cops stood there, listened to our ridiculous explanation, and just looked so completely done with life. Story 43. A guy flew past me in the emergency lane while we were sitting in stopped traffic due to a crash a few miles up the road. Naturally, I pulled into the lane, lit him up, and got him to stop. I walked up to the car and went, "Dude, what the hell? Are you serious?" Yeah, that's when I noticed he was sweating. Not just nervous sweating, shit sweating. Like, I should probably call EMS sweating. The guy looked on the verge of tears and frantically explained he had gone to lunch at a buddy's house, fell asleep after eating, and woke up realizing something was very, very wrong. He didn't want to destroy his friend's bathroom, so he made a desperate run for home. Honestly, fair. Still, I asked for his license, registration, the whole 9 yards, because if he was going to pull a moron move, I might as well go through the motions. But I didn't ticket him. Figured the high risk of him shitting himself in traffic was already a worse punishment than a $163 fine and 3 points on his license. Told him to stay in the travel lanes like everyone else, and that I expected to see his car at the gas station half a mile up the road. Sure enough, when I drove by later, his car was parked there. So I assume he made it in time. Story 44. Late one night, there was a driver acting suspiciously in an area known for drug deals, so an officer pulled him over and asked, "What are you doing here in the middle of the night?" The guy stalled and stuttered, clearly struggling to come up with something. Then he finally said, "I'm just waiting on my friend." The officer asked, "And what's your friend doing?" More stalling, more hesitation. Then, she's bringing me an alarm clock. At this point, it was obvious he was making shit up on the spot. But then, another car pulled up in front of them. A woman got out holding a Walmart bag, and inside, an actual alarm clock. Saw this happen on an episode of Live PD, and I still can't get over it. Story 45. Not a cop, but this happened when my then girlfriend was driving me home after I had a very big night out. I had spilled whiskey all over myself, so I reeked of booze, like absolutely marinated in it. We got pulled over and the cop breathalyzed her. It came back positive. She immediately burst into tears, insisting she was the designated driver and there had to be some mistake. The cop quickly realized what was going on and had her step out of the car to take another breath test away from me and my booze-soaked mess. She collected herself, took the second test, and passed. The cop walked back to the car, looked right at me, and said, "You owe your girlfriend McDonald's." I didn't argue. I was way too excited to stuff my face with food. Story 46. Not a cop, but I've got a story. My friend's dad had to have all of his teeth extracted and replaced with veneers because of severe pain. But for whatever reason, he had to wait a while before getting them removed. During this time, he couldn't chew properly, so he developed a habit of crushing up Trebor extra strong mints and eating them with a spoon. One day, he crushed up almost an entire 4-pack, sealed the powder in a plastic bag, and went on his way, without even considering how suspicious that might look. Sure enough, police pulled him over and immediately arrested him, thinking the bag was full of cocaine. He kept insisting, "Just open the bag and smell it." But the cops just laughed at him like, "Oh, you think we'd fall for that?" Even when they finally did open it, They were still convinced he had just mixed in some mints to throw them off. I don't know how long they held him, but he missed work, and my friend had to come over for dinner because both of her parents were stuck sorting it out. Story 47. My wife's dad was a fire investigator, and one time he was called to investigate a house fire. The homeowner told him the most ridiculous story. They had heard a weird noise under the house, and instead of using a flashlight like a normal person, they tied a candle to a turtle's back and sent it under there to check it out. Later, while combing through the wreckage, my wife's dad actually found the burned up turtle with wax on it. Turns out the insane story was completely true. Story 48. There was a luggage mix-up at the airport, and this guy accidentally grabbed the wrong bag. Because of that, he ended up wearing a suit that was way too big for him. When I pulled him over, I immediately noticed a bag of white powder sitting on the passenger seat. Of course, he hit me with the classic, "It's not mine." Sure, buddy. We called the actual owner of the luggage, and sure enough, it was his mother's ashes. Story 49. Not a cop, but this is tangentially related. One summer night in high school, I was playing cat and mouse with a friend, basically driving around town trying to lose each other. I was doing about twice the speed limit on a road at the edge of town when I decided to kill the engine, to cut my lights, and turn onto a small, unused road to hide. Lo and behold, there was a cop sitting right there. He watched me roll in with my engine off, and of course came over to see what the hell I was up to. "So, why'd you pull in here?" Thinking fast, I said, "I don't know. My car just died." The cop nodded and went, I bet it's just vapor lock. Watch this." Then he opened my gas cap, which let out a huge hiss, something that apparently happens with vapor lock. "Try it now." I turned the key, car started right up. I just nodded, said, "Thanks, and drove off into the night. Story 50. My wife's story. She got pulled over for something stupid like a busted license plate light. When the cop asked for her license, she handed him a half-burned driver's license. The cop just looked at it and went, "What is this?" She explained that her iPhone exploded and burned her license, along with a bunch of other cards. Cop didn't believe it, but it was 100% true. Our headboard still has a scorch mark to prove it. Story 51. Obligatory, not a cop, but I've got a good one for you. I used to breed and rescue snakes and reptiles. One day, a friend of mine, who happened to be a male exotic dancer, decided to buy a snake from me. Since our schedules never lined up, I offered to deliver the snake, terrarium, and feeders to him after work. No big deal. I'm a night owl, so a 3 a.m. drive didn't bother me. The night comes, and I'm on my way. Out of nowhere, I hear sirens and see flashing lights. I pull over, assuming the cop will speed past me since I wasn't speeding, had no broken lights, and wasn't doing anything wrong. But nope, he pulls in right behind me. Officer. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Me. "No." Officer. "That lane change was reckless. You nearly killed me." I'm sitting there, confused, because I used my signal, checked my mirrors, and didn't see another soul on the road, because, it's 3 a.m. Me. "What?" Officer. "You nearly ran me off the road." Me. "Where? When? How?" He then explains that he was in the next lane, and I apparently cut him off. Me. "Officer, I swear I didn't see you. Maybe if you had your headlights on, I would have noticed your black car blending into the night." He pauses, glances back at his vehicle, and realizes his headlights are off. Cue awkward silence. Officer. "Oh. Well, where are you going at this hour? Can I see your papers?" Me. "I'm delivering a snake to a friend." Officer. "At 3 a.m.? Me. "Yep." I reach over, grab my purse from the passenger seat, and casually hand him a tied-off pillowcase. Me. "Here, hold this while I find my license." Officer. "Sure, no prob. Ah. Cue high-pitched screaming. Pillowcase goes flying. "What the hell is in that?" "It moved." Me. "Oh, that's just the snake I'm delivering." The man turns ghost white. He stares at me, then at the pillowcase, then back at me. Without another word, he power walks back to his car, flips on his headlights, finally, and speeds off into the night. I hop out, pick up my poor traumatized snake, and continue my trip like nothing happened. Story 52. Not an officer, but I got pulled over the other day for the first time in decades. Officer. "Where are you off to in such a hurry?" Me. "Actually, I'm on my way to jury duty." He gives me a look, then disappears back to his car for what feels like forever, probably running my squeaky clean record. When he finally returns. Officer. "Do you have a copy of the summons?" Me. "Yes, sir. I just had it out to put the address into my GPS." Hands it over. The officer studies it for a second, then shakes his head with a small smirk. Officer. "Well, I've never actually pulled anyone over who had a real jury summons, so I'm going to let you go, but slow it down. What are they going to do if you're late?" Me. Thank you, officer. I really appreciate it. And while I wasn't intentionally speeding, the summons does say I could get a bench warrant for being late or failing to appear, but I promise I'll watch my speed. He just chuckled and waved me on my way. Gotta love an unexpected get-out-of-a-ticket-free card. Story 53. Not a cop, but here's a funny story where an officer heard what sounded like a total BS excuse, but it turned out to be 100% true. A guy was driving with his infant when a cop pulled him over, not sure on the exact reason. During the stop, they searched his car and found a box of First Foods rice cereal, which, as any parent knows, looked suspiciously like drugs. The officer, convinced he had just made a major drug bust, charged the guy with possession without even testing it. The driver, obviously frustrated, insisted it was just baby food and demanded they actually check it. When they finally did, the test came back completely negative for cocaine, or any other drug for that matter. He took that evidence to court, and if I remember correctly, he's now suing the police department for false charges. Story 54, Australian here. We have random roadside breath and drug testing. Pretty standard stuff. One night I was driving back from work, taking a detour to a sister pharmacy to transfer some stock. I get pulled over, go through the usual breath test, and pass with flying colors. Then comes the big question. Officer, do you have any drugs in here? I'd never been asked that before, but considering the dodgy area, I guess it made sense. I glance at the pile of stock next to me, look back at the officer, and, without thinking, awkwardly say, maybe? Cue immediate regret. They direct me to pull over to the side, and 2 more officers approach. Officer, what drugs do you have in your possession? At this point, I'm feeling incredibly dumb and scrambling for words. Me. I work at a pharmacy. I'm just transferring stock to another location, and, I actually don't know what's in the box. The officers give me the, yeah, sure, mate, look, but stay professional. They open the box, and right on top, a big pack of incontinence pads. Under that, totally harmless items like toothbrushes and over-the-counter painkillers. Then, of course, right at the bottom, benzos. You know, the kind that sell well on the street. Oh, and some heavy-duty cancer meds, for good measure. I quickly pull out the invoice, but since my pharmacy was closed, the officers had to call my boss. He picks up, casually greeting me with the sound of screaming kids in the background while reassuring the officers that yes, this was a legit transfer. Next, they call the pharmacy I'm headed to. The pharmacist in charge is new and has a strong accent, which makes things even more confusing. Eventually, though, they get the right confirmations and decide to let me go. Relieved, I sit back in my car, ready to drive off, when one of the officers walks up to my window with a massive grin. Officer, make sure you take good care of them pads, yeah? I glance at the box. Everything's been repacked except for the incontinence pads, which are now sitting on the passenger seat like they're the most precious cargo ever. I buckle my seatbelt over them, nod seriously, and the officer laughs as I finally head off to the pharmacy. Story 55. Not a cop, but I was on the receiving end of one of these encounters. I didn't drink at all until I was about 25. 0, nothing, ever. When I was 18, some friends and I went out to Brewster's for ice cream. My buddy David went all in and got a full pint of rum raisin. At some point, he managed to spill the entire thing in the backseat floorboard. It reeked. This awful, pungent fake rum smell just filled the whole car. I figured, whatever, I'll clean it out tomorrow. After dropping him off around midnight, I started my 30-minute drive home. One of my headlights was out, and sure enough, a cop pulled me over in the parking lot of a Holiday Inn. The second I rolled my window down, the smell hit him. Officer, how many drinks have you had tonight? Me. None. I don't drink. Ever. Officer, I can smell it on you. Cue me trying to explain the absolute dumbest sounding excuse ever. Me. So, my friend spilled an entire pint of rum raisin ice cream in my car. That's what you're smelling. The officer doesn't even dignify that with a response. Instead, he presses his radio. We got a 707 code. He's denying it. Next thing I know, I'm being asked to step out of the car for a field sobriety test. No breathalyzer, just the classics. Touching my nose, walking a straight line, saying the alphabet backward. As I'm in the middle of this, a massive crowd of people in suits and gowns spills out of the Holiday Inn and immediately stops to gawk. So now I've got an entire audience watching me get tested for being absolutely hammered on ice cream fumes. I pass with flying colors, of course, but the cop isn't buying it. He calls in for someone to bring a breathalyzer. We stand there awkwardly for about 30 minutes waiting for it. When the second cop finally arrives, I try to plead my case again. Me. I know this sounds like total BS, but this is all because of rum raisin ice cream. I don't drink. They eye roll but hand me the breathalyzer. I blow a perfect 0. Does this convince them? No. The breathalyzer must be broken, so they call in another cop to bring another breathalyzer. By this point, I've been standing in this parking lot for nearly an hour, surrounded by 3 cop cars, looking like I'm about to be booked for something serious. I decide to embrace the absurdity. Me. All right, watch this. I bet you any amount of money the next breathalyzer will also be dead zero. How much do you want to bet me? They are not amused. Another half hour passes. A third cop shows up, this time with 2 breathalyzers. I blow 2 more perfect zeros. At this point, they have to accept my ridiculous yet undeniably true story, but clearly they're not thrilled about it. So instead of just letting me go, they somehow managed to write me 3 different tickets, all for my busted headlight. Because if they couldn't get me for imaginary drunkenness, they were at least going to get me for something. Story 56, not a cop, but I want this to reach hot. So here's a story for you. I was stuck in a massive traffic jam because people were making extra lanes to turn onto a busy road in my city. Total chaos. By the time I finally broke free, I absolutely floored it out of pure frustration, going well over 120 km/h in a 60 zone. Yeah, not my brightest moment. Of course, right then, a cop pulls me over. As soon as he walks up to my car, I don't even let him speak. Still fuming, I blurt out, "Yeah, I know I was speeding, but instead of stopping me, maybe you should go find the idiots causing the traffic jam." I only did it out of frustration, and I said it angrily. The cop just looks at me for a second, then bursts out laughing. Cop, you know what? You're right. And just like that, he lets me go. For everyone thinking this is fake, here's some context. This happened in Colombia, where I live. Traffic laws here are basically a suggestion unless there's a cop around. And even then, police are often more interested in bribes than actually enforcing the rules. Most people are scared of them because if you don't pay up, you get a ticket. But instead of acting scared, I got mad at him for not doing his job, and I think that's what caught him off guard. Moral of the story, sometimes frustration speaks the truth. Story 57. When I was 18, I got pulled over around 2 a.m. The cop thought I had been drinking because I was swerving a little. Small country road, no traffic, just me vibing. He asked all the usual questions, but I could tell he did not believe me when I said I hadn't been drinking. The real reason? I was just dancing to the music to keep myself awake. Then came the pen light test. You know, follow the light with your eyes, don't move your head. Unfortunately, my eyes were dry as hell from being tired and having the heat blasting, so I failed. Great. To make things even funnier, my house was literally in sight from where I got pulled over. When he asked where I lived, I pointed at the only house around. Again, he didn't believe me. So what does he do? Follows me to my driveway. Not only that, but he actually waited outside until I unlocked the door and went inside before finally pulling away. Long story short, car dancing got me pulled over for drunk driving. Cop didn't believe my house was my house until I physically entered it. Story 58. My cousin was a cop, and one night he pulled someone over for speeding. Standard traffic stop, flashlight out, usual routine. But the driver wasn't cooperating at all, not being an asshole, just not responding. Cousin asks again for his license and registration. The guy just points to the side of his head and shrugs, full on. Cousin repeats himself, louder this time. Same response, stone-faced, silent, just keeps shrugging and pointing at his head. At this point, it's feeling like one of those sovereign citizen traffic stops. If you've seen them on YouTube, you know the type. Frustrated, my cousin finally grabs him by the lapel, yanks him through the window, and slams him onto the car. That's when the guy finally speaks. "I'm deaf. I'm deaf." In the most whoppy deaf guy voice imaginable. Turns out he wasn't mocking my cousin. He was literally pointing at his ears and shrugging to say, "I can't hear you." And the reason he wasn't responding? My cousin's flashlight was blinding him, so he couldn't read his lips. Cousin verifies his story. Probably checked a license restriction or something. And yep, the guy is actually deaf. Cue instant guilt. So instead of writing him a ticket, my cousin dusted him off, apologized profusely, and told him to slow down. Moral of the story? Sometimes a shrug isn't attitude. It's sign language for, please don't throw me onto my car. Story 59. A few years ago, my family took a road trip, and we stopped in Madison, WI for a break. My dad, who was and still is obsessed with the game Ingress, decided to wander off in search of portals while my mom, brother, and I chilled at a park. What we didn't notice, but probably should have, was a cop car circling us twice. Apparently, they only saw my mom sitting alone, and since they didn't see me or my brother, assumed she was a prostitute. Fast forward a bit, my dad comes back and we all walk to the car. The second we close the doors, 2 cops flank the vehicle and start knocking on the windows. My dad rolls down his window, and cop number 1 takes one look at him, then at my mom. then spots me and my little brother in the back seat. His eyes go wide, and he immediately starts laughing. I guess that was the moment he realized my mom was, in fact, not a hooker. Still, they asked my dad to step out of the car. Out of earshot from us, the officer tells him, "Yeah, we thought your wife was a prostitute you picked up." My dad cracks up and explains that he had just been off playing a phone game while my mom was waiting at the park. Meanwhile, my mom, absolutely fuming. Story 60. I once let the local cop search my car because, well, I had nothing to hide. One of the officers started getting way too excited over something he found, an overturned bottle cap on the floor. He picks it up like it's evidence from a crime scene, and I can see the gears turning in his head. Problem is, it was from an IBC root beer. Then he spots something else. He bends down, picks it up, and turns to me with a dead serious expression. "Cop, I just have one question for you." Me. Yes? Cop, Empire or Republic? I freeze for a second, realizing what he's holding, a physical copy of Star Wars, The Old Republic. I smirk. Empire, obviously. And just like that, we nerd out about Star Wars for a solid few minutes, while his partner just stands there shaking his head like, "I can't believe this is happening." Moral of the story. Sometimes the Force is with you, even during a car search. Story 61. Pulled up to a running car at the end of a dead-end street around 11:30 p.m. one night. Suspicious, but nothing too crazy. I knock on the window, and a young guy in his 20s is in the driver's seat, looking nervous. In the back seat, there's a girl in her late teens, casually reading a magazine. I ask if everything is okay. They both nod and assure me they're fine, but something just feels off. So I ask, "Why are you two sitting in separate seats?" Without a second of hesitation, the girl looks up from her magazine and says, "I'm 17. In about 20 minutes, I'll be 18, and this is my boyfriend." I check their IDs, and sure enough, she's telling the truth. Pretty sure they had a very eventful birthday celebration after that. Story 62. Not a cop or someone who's been pulled over, but my old boss, a cardiologist, once had a pretty wild run-in with the police. One night, he got an emergency call from a hospital he was covering. A patient had severe fluid buildup around their heart and was on the verge of cardiac arrest. The in-house junior doctor had no idea how to handle it, so my boss did the only logical thing, sped like hell to the hospital, cue flashing lights in his rearview mirror. A cop starts chasing him down, and my boss reluctantly pulls over. He tries to explain the situation, but understandably, the officer doesn't believe him. Time is running out, so my boss just ignores the cop and floors it. Now it's a full-on police pursuit. He screeches into the hospital, abandons his car in the ambulance bay, and sprints inside. The cop follows right behind, but doesn't catch up to him until he's at the patient's bedside, already sticking a needle into their chest. That was the moment the cop realized he wasn't being bullshitted. Oh, and the patient survived.